Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. You often have scenarios where a fragment and its hosting activity need to talk to each other. For example, a button click in a fragment might need to trigger an action within the activity, or the activity might need to update some information displayed within fragments. And in this video, we are going to learn how to do this. We're going to first establish activity-to-fragment communication to see how activities and fragments communicate, and then we are going to discover how fragments communicate between each other. So let's start with an example here. What I want to do is whenever I click on a button within the activity, I want to update something or modify something within any of the fragments. And here, since we have an instance of our first and second fragment, we can simply create a function within the fragment class and call it within our activity. So let's see how this works. Here I'm going to enter our first fragment class, and I'm going to create a function. Whenever we call this function, we are going to modify the first fragment TV, which is a text view within the first fragment. So let's create this function here, fun modify text, and it's going to take a string. So I'm going to call it new string is of type string. Now here, call the binding dot first fragment TV dot text and assign that text to our new string passed to the function. Now, within our main activity, let's take a look at the layout. So here, within our main activity layout, we want to add a button here on the bottom. So whenever we click on that button, we want to invoke the function. So let's add that very quickly. Here, I'm going to give this button ID, modify frag button, btn for short, and here, modify frag. Now here within our main activity, let's add a click listener to that button. So binding dot modify frag btn dot set on click listener. Here, whenever we click on this button, we want to invoke the first fragment function, which is the modify text. Here we could simply pass any text. You could also do it with an edit text, so it can change dynamically according to your edit text. In this case, I'm just going to make it static. So here is our new text, for example. Now let's run to see the result. So here within our app, if you click on the button now, it will invoke the function and therefore it will edit the text within the first fragment. Now, what if you need to communicate from a fragment to an activity? Would it be the same? Would we just define a function within an activity and call it from the fragment? Well, it's yes and no. It is possible, but has one drawback or one problem. Now, before discussing this problem, let's just implement this example. So here what we want to do is to do completely the opposite of what we have done here. Instead of calling the function from the fragment or making some modification from our activity to the fragment, we want to make some modifications from the fragment within the activity. So what we are going to do is to create the function within our main activity now. So let's create a function, and it's going to be fun modify text. Again, takes a new string of type string and assigns that text to our button here. Since we don't have a text view, so we're just going to modify the text of the button. Here, binding dot modify button dot text equal to new string. And now we want to call this function from the first fragment. Let's go to the first fragment. Now in this case, we don't need this function no more, so I'm just going to delete it. And here we have to get access, or we have to get a reference to our activity. How we can do this? If you remember from the last video that the onAttach callback is used to establish fragment and activity communication. So here we are going to override the onAttach callback. And you can see that the onAttach callback gives you a context. And this context comes from the host activity that hosts the fragment. So with this context, you can get a reference to the activity. So here you're going to say activity equal to context. And here we have to cast it to activity, so as main activity. And that's it. Here you can use this variable here to call the function of the activity, activity.modify text. But in this case, we don't want to do it this way. We want to do it whenever we click on a button or a text or any other UI element within the first fragment. So here we have to make this activity as a property within our class. So let's make it private var, which is activity of type main activity, initially might be null. And here assign the activity to this main activity. And whenever we click on the text view, for example, we want to modify the button's text within the main activity. So here, binding.firstFragmentTV.set on click listener. Yeah, and I do have a click listener already, so let's just get rid of this. Here, I'm going to say activity.modify text. Here, let's pass our text from fragment. And now we are going to run to see how this would work. But in this case, we have a problem because the activity is initially null. So we get a compile time error saying that it may not have been initialized. So in this case, we have to add the question mark. And now we are going to run to see how this works. So now, whenever we click on the first fragment text, the button's text should change. Here, you can see that the text changes and we got that text from the first fragment. Now, instead of using the onAttach callback to get a reference to the activity, we also have an alternative way to do this. We could do it by using the require activity function within fragments. So here, within our example, instead of activity, call the require activity function. And in this case, it just gets the activity associated with this fragment. So you have to first cast it to the main activity or your activity, which is associated with your fragment. So here, cast it to as main activity, put it within parentheses, and now we can seamlessly call the modify function or modify text function. Now, I'm going to run and explain what is the difference between the two methods, require activity or just getting a reference to the activity by using the onAttach callback. Well, the onAttach callback, as you may know, it's the first to be called within the lifecycle of the fragment. It passes a context and you can simply get access to the activity by casting the context to the main activity. But the problem is the activity might not always be fully initialized when the onAttach is called. So this might cause problems. So the best thing to do is to use the require activity and cast it to a main activity, then call your required function, as the required activity is considered to be safer than the onAttach callback. But in some cases though, onAttach is preferred, and we are going to see this in a moment. So now, why this way is considered to be not useful? Why making a function within an activity, then call that function from your fragments is not considered to be very useful? Well, as we have discussed before, fragments are considered to be reusable components. So here, what we have done is that we have tightly coupled or tightly connected the first fragment with the main activity. So that means the first fragment will not be very reusable with other activities or other fragments if we are hosting this fragment on another fragment. So that means that the first fragment here should only be used within the main activity, since we statically said that here within our code. Now, some might say that we can create activities and make them extend some base activity, for example, the activity class, which every activity extend that class, and create the function within the activity class that we created and make every other activity within our app extend from this class, and therefore we would have access to the function. Now the problem is the first fragment will be tightly coupled to these components, and it will not be used within any other components unless they implement the modify text function. And that also means that the first fragment will not be ever capable of being hosted within another fragment. It will only be hosted within activities since we coded our code this way. So the alternative is to use an interface. Interfaces or an interface is like a contract. It defines a set of methods that a class, in this case our activity, must implement. Using interfaces makes our code more maintainable, easier to understand, and most importantly, makes our fragments more reusable. So instead of doing all of this, let's create an interface. So here within our first fragment, feel free to create the interface within a separate file. In this case, I'm going to create it here, just underneath the ViewModel. So interface, I'm going to call it on-fragment communication. You can call it whatever you want. The convention to call fragments that are used for communication or used as callbacks is by using on, then whatever the sentence is, like the on-click listener, for example. And here I'm going to create a single function, and it's going to be called on communicate. And for example, we are going to pass some kind of string. So again, new string is of type string. Now, since this is an interface, we don't have to implement the function. So here we are going to go back to our main activity and we are going to implement the on-fragment communication interface. And lastly, we have to implement the single function. So press Ctrl I and implement the onCommunicate. Now here, again, we want to modify the text of the button. And instead of using this function, we are going to use the function from the interface instead. So here, put this here and get rid of the function now. Now the only thing left is to go to our first fragment, and here we are going to use the onAttach to get a reference to the activity, but not specifically an activity. We are going to get a reference to the interface. So here I'm going to get rid of these, and here I'm going to get a variable of type onFragment Communication, so private latent var. In this case, it doesn't have any connection with the UI, so I'm safe to declare it with the latent modifier within the fragment. I'm going to call it a listener, is of type onFragment Communication. And here within the onAttach, we are going to assign this listener to the context. Then we have to cast it to onFragment Communication. So why is that? Well, since our activity actually implements the onFragment Communication, then it is of type onFragment Communication. And here within our first fragment, we are safe to do this casting. And now after initializing the listener, we are safe to use the listener here instead of this line of code here. So now listener and call onCommunicate. Here we are going to pass the same string. So here is our text from fragment. And now let's run to see how this works. Again, here within our app, if you click on the text view from the fragment, we are going to modify the button text. Now, what is the difference between the two methods? The first approach was bad because it makes the fragment less reusable. It makes the fragment tightly coupled or tightly connected to the activity that we casted it to. But in this case, we're using an interface. So we can make other classes like activity or fragment implement this interface. And in this way, we can host the fragment within any activity, within any other fragment, without having to worry about which type of class or activity or fragment that we are casting this context to. Now, what if you need to communicate between two different fragments within the activity? Well, in our example now, it wouldn't work because we have two fragments on top of each other and they get replaced within the same space. However, if your activity is separated by fragments, like for example, the top portion of the screen has some kind of fragment, the bottom portion of the screen has some kind of fragment, and they are both visible to the user, then you could simply use, again, the same interface by using the main activity as a mediator or as middleman between the two fragments. So in this case, we just implemented the interface, and here within the onCommunicate, instead of just modifying something within the activity, you could simply modify something within the fragment which is already visible. So again, the same example, first fragment on the top, second fragment on the bottom. And here you're going to use support fragment manager, and you are going to use find fragment by ID. In this case, it finds the fragment which is connected to the container. So our main activity here has one container only, which has this ID. So in this case, I'm passing this ID here, and it will get me the fragment which is already present within this container. So say for instance, I have a container 1 here and container 2, and I want to send some data from fragment 1 to fragment 2. So in this case, I have to pass fragment 2 container, or the container that contains our target fragment, which is fragment 2. And here, after sending the container, then we have to cast to the fragment or the name of the fragment, in this case, second fragment. And now we could simply call any function within that fragment. So say for instance, you have defined some functions to call within the second fragment, like modify text or modify data or update data or anything. Here you can call it, and whenever this function is invoked within the first fragment, it will therefore invoke the function within the onCommunicate and finally call the function that you called from the second fragment. Now, as an alternative way to communicate between activities, fragments, or fragments to fragments is by using the ViewModel. Now, ViewModel seems to be the universal solution to everything, but in this case, it will be very much useful to use a global ViewModel or activity ViewModel that is connected to the fragments to ease the communication between those components, rather than using interfaces or any other functions. So what I want to do is to create a ViewModel associated with our activity, and get an instance of this view model within our second fragment and our first fragment, and therefore our view model will act as a storage to our data, as it will be very useful to preserve the state of the data and keep the latest value of those data across the navigation destinations. So here I'm going to create our view model. I'm going to call it class main view model extends the view model class. And here I'm willing to have three texts or three variables. The first one is going to be var activity text, initially set to nothing, var frag1 text, again initially set to nothing or empty string, frag2 text, initially set to an empty string. Now we are going to use these three variables and we are going to edit them from whatever destination we would like to. If you want to edit all of them three within the main activity, you can do that. If you want to edit all of these three from any of the fragments, you can also do that. Now let's go to the onCreate within our main activity and create an instance of our view model. So here val view model equal to view model provider, pass an owner, so our main activity is the owner, and here pass get. In this case, main activity or main view model class.java. And here our view model is of type main view model. We would also like to create this view model within our fragments. So here, go to the first fragment. I'll create this as a property since we are going to call it within our view created. So here, private var or private latent var main view model of type main view model, and within our onCreate main view model equal to view model provider. And here, be careful, don't pass this. If you pass this here, it will make the view model here, or this instance of the view model, connected to the fragment. In this case, we don't want to create a separate view model connected with a fragment. What we want to get is the view model which is already connected to our activity. So in this case, when you pass the owner, you could either pass require activity as the owner, or you could pass require context. Both would work and both would lead to the same instance of the main view model that we created within our main activity. So back to the first fragment, and here again get the same type. So main view model class.java. Here it says that it requires a view model store owner. Yeah, I was mistaken. We cannot pass a context. We have to pass an activity or some kind of component like the fragment. So here we have to pass require activity instead. Now, so since we have the same instance within the main activity, within the first fragment, then we have the same values of these three. Whenever we modify any of these, we are going to get the same variables. So the first thing that I would like to do is to modify the main text from our first fragment and get that text to be displayed within our main activity. Here within the onViewCreated, whenever we click on the button here, the first fragment button, what I want to do is to modify the text. So main view model dot activity text equal to text modified from frag1. Again, I want to do the same thing with our second fragment. So within our second fragment here class, we didn't use it in the last video to create its UI or anything. But since we are passing the layout within the constructor, so we can simply override the onViewCreated. As we have learned before that if you passed the view here, then you can simply just override the onViewCreated and play around with the views. So here I want to override the onViewCreated and get access to the view model. So for that, I will also override the onCreate and I will create again an instance of the view model. Let's make that very quickly. Go to the first fragment to get the instance or to get the same code. And here within the second fragment, we are going to use this view find view by ID function. It's a text view. Let's go see the ID of the text view here within second fragment, second frag TV. So pass r.id.second frag TV. Now, whenever we click on the set frag TV, I want to modify the text of the main activity from the main view model. So main view model dot activity text equal to text modified from frag2. Now let's run to see how this works. But the only thing that I want to do is to assign this variable to the text view within our main activity. So currently we don't have any text view within our main activity. We only have a button. So whenever I click on this button, I want to update the text of the same button. So let's just do that. Update. I'm going to call it update btn. Back to the main activity. Here, binding dot update btn dot set on click listener. I'm going to say binding dot update btn dot text equal to ViewModel dot activity text. Now let's run to see how this works. So here you can see if you click on the first fragment button, then the first or the main activity text is going to be changed. If you click on update now, you can see that this text now is text modified from frag1. Go to the frag2, click on the text, and now click on the button. You can see that the text is modified from frag2. Now you could also do the same thing with the frag1 text and frag2 text if you would like to. Whenever you click on some kind of an UI component within the first fragment, then modify that text. And whenever the view is being created, for example here within the onView created, you can do the same thing by saying if the main ViewModel.text.frag1 text is not empty, then we want to simply set that text to the frag1 text that comes from the main ViewModel. But before doing that, don't forget to modify this value first whenever some events happen, like a button click or any other events. Now I know this might be very overwhelming to interact with activities, fragments, and different UI components. But in the next videos, we are going to see how we can simplify things with the navigation components library. So that was it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope I see you in the next video.